having some special segments. And one of the special segments we will be talking about right now is about the national anthem and the requirement to stand. This is all coming into conversation obviously about the NFL, but also because students in Manatee County, Florida, are trying to do away with a school district code of conduct that requires them to stand for the national anthem. The national anthem. So this is a conversation that we keep having every day in the media and law. And to help us understand a little bit about this case, but also about the NFL, we are pleased to have with us today Associate Professor of Brooklyn Law School, Jodi S. Balsam. And Professor Balsam was previously the National Football League's Counsel for Operations and Litigation, where she managed litigation in all areas of law and oversaw a variety of policy and operational matters, negotiated contracts for the league, and administered the league's internal dispute resolution processes and compliance program. I hope I got that title right, Professor.
Thank you, yes, and thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you. So, let's start off with this conversation. A lot of people are confused about the First Amendment and the right to stand or the right not to stand. Please settle it for us. Is it unconstitutional for a school district or for the NFL to require students or players to stand during the national anthem?
Well, the distinction that has to be made here is between public and private institutions. A private institution, a private employer, a private school can require their participants in their programs, their employees, their students, to comply with a code of conduct that requires them to stand. There are limitations on that blanket statement, but the distinction that needs to be made here is between public and private institutions. The public schools in Florida who are attempting to enforce their codes requiring students to stand during the anthem come up against some undeniable Supreme Court precedent that says that students have a right to silent, non-disruptive protest in the public schools. They have a right, in other words, not to speak, not to display respect for an emblem or an image that they don't agree with or that they have a reason to protest against.
So then how does it make sense? Do you think that the students actually do have a cause of action here? Do they actually have a right to say, we don't need to stand up for the national anthem? And if that's the case, or the Pledge of Allegiance, excuse me, if that's the case, will that just go across the country? Will this change? I remember when I was a little kid, I had to stand up. I stand up. I never even questioned it. Now we're living in an age where you can question it. What does that mean for that school district? And what would that mean for school districts across the country?
So again, I want to emphasize, we're talking about public schools because alongside those public schools in Florida who are confronting this issue, a number of private schools, including in Florida and elsewhere, have re-emphasized to their student bodies that they are expected to stand for the anthem. And there is no First Amendment right of those students to disobey. But in the public schools, this is nothing new. The case, the lead case in this area dates back to 1943 when the Supreme Court held that it was unconstitutional to force students to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. It was a form of forced speech that in that particular case and others contradicted students' rights of religious freedom. So this anthem issue, the students can comfortably rely on that case. The only way that you can force students to comply with this sort of code of conduct, a recite the pledge requirement, is if what is happening is disruptive to the school. Schools have a right to regulate student expression if the student conduct or speech would materially and substantially disrupt work and discipline of the school. If that's happening, the school can't step in, but it doesn't look like that's happening with a simple refusal to stand or salute the flag during the anthem.
So in other words, if this is a form of protest and it turns into, protest gets bigger, more active, but it does disrupt school activities in a way. Maybe kids are missing class, they're cutting class to do protest. Maybe it's creating a disruption to school environment. Then that's when there might be a situation that their right to free speech, their right to protest is a bit restricted. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding it and that the viewers are understanding it, correct?
That's correct. And the schools have a few other potential arguments here. One is, of course, is this disruptive? But another is a school has a right not to sponsor speech that it disagrees with. So if the student's speech is in a forum in which school sponsorship of that speech would be communicated, the school can shut it down. So the school does not have to, for example, allow its school newspaper to be used to sponsor speech that it disagrees with. There is also an argument some schools are making that certain aspects of school participation are privileges, not rights. So, for example, football team participation has been described by some schools as not an entitlement, not a privilege that everybody is entitled to participate in. It depends on student, obviously, skills and ability on the football field, but also compliance with team rules. And football teams at some of these public schools are arguing that they can condition student participation on the team with complying with a code that requires standing and respecting the flag during the anthem. That argument has yet to be settled, although there is some good law out there that says that a public institution can't condition even a privilege, such as participation on a football team, with sacrificing your free speech rights.
That makes sense. That makes sense. But what doesn't make sense to me then is this case that I mentioned out of Manatee County. There's also a Florida statute. And the statute says that each district school board may adopt rules to require in all of the schools of the district programs of a patriotic nature to encourage greater respect for the government of the United States and its national anthem and flag. And it goes on to say that one of the things is to stand during the national anthem. So how would this statute be passed if there is a constitutional right for children to not, if they don't have to stand? How is it? And I want to talk about it a little bit because I guess what I'm seeing is there has something to do with the parents' rights as well. Can you speak a little bit about this statute?
Yes. So even though this First Amendment right exists for students to engage in silent, non-disruptive protest, by the same token, the schools have the right to state their preference. The schools have a right to engage in speech as well and to announce to the world, to their communities, what they stand for in terms of their values. But the fact that a statute has required schools to express their patriotism or invited them to express their patriotism and to announce to their students, this is the school's message, value system, and preference on this issue, that does not mean they can force the students to stand or salute. The First Amendment right, as articulated in those Supreme Court precedents that I described, trump whatever this Florida statute is trying to accomplish.
And the idea that you would need your parents' permission to opt out of standing, isn't that not necessary? Because the children, don't they have a First Amendment right to not stand up? So why even put out an opt-out provision even in the statute?
Well, the parents actually do have a right to control what their students do on and off, what their children do on and off school property, right? So the parents' right is actually ahead of the students' rights in terms of the First Amendment issues here. And the parents, if they so desire, can discipline their children in a legally permissible way for not obeying the school's code of conduct. That is a parental prerogative that is unchanged, at least until the student hits the age of majority.
There was a 11th Circuit Court of Appeals ruling in 2008, Frazier v. Wynn, which upheld this Florida law. The student in that case objected to the law's provision requiring parental permission to abstain from the pledge, but judges said the decision is up to parents. They said the state, in restricting the student's freedom of speech, advances the protection of the constitutional rights of parents, an interest which the state may lawfully protect. What do you think about that statement?
That's absolutely correct. As I was trying to describe, maybe not that effectively, parents have an absolute right to determine their children's moral and values education until they're 18. And as long as they're doing so within the laws that are respecting parental neglect and abuse, right? So they can determine for their children what speech is permissible for their children until the age of 18. That parental prerogative is unchanged by the First Amendment law that allows students to protest the flag or refuse to recite the pledge. If a parent steps in and says, I don't want my student to engage in this, my child to engage in this speech as a student in your school, my child must stand for the pledge. That's a rule I'm imposing on my child that is within the parent's rights. The school can't force the student to stand, the parent can.
Interesting. Well, let's move out of the parents and the children, because what really we're talking about and what the elephant in the room is The NFL. Let's talk a little bit about the NFL and everything that's been going on with the right to kneel during the national anthem. Before we get into the law of it, I just want to know, you used to work for the NFL in a very prestigious position. Have you ever seen anything like this take place during your time there? Is this something that's new? And what are your thoughts about what's been happening in the past few months or so?
Well, the players have used their celebrity, their talents, their fame to advance a lot of social causes over the years. Right? It's not just about protesting police brutality or some form of government conduct that the players disagree with. Throughout the time I was there, and for decades, players have advanced very laudable social causes, from schools, education, avoidance of substance abuse, uplifting underprivileged communities. So I applaud players who use that platform to move forward on social causes. Whether they've done it as in a public way, as not kneeling or not standing for the anthem, that didn't happen while I was there, but we certainly supported them through our player services department in the charitable initiatives that they undertook. In fact, there was something known then, and I think it's still ongoing now, Public Service Tuesdays. The playing week used to be scheduled so that players had Tuesdays off from practice, training, watching films, with the purpose of going out into their communities and doing good. And players still do that to this day.
And what would you say to the argument that that's all well and good, and it's great that they're advancing those causes, but they're football players? Just play, stop getting involved in this. And teams that employ these players, they say, you know what? You don't want to stand up, then we want to take some sort of repercussions. We want to reprimand you in some way. What would your argument be to those people who say, just play the game, we don't want to have to think about this?
Well, there's obviously a legal argument, and there's also a business argument. And the business of the NFL is to play football. They understand that. The Players Association understands that. They recently conducted meetings to try to find a way to move forward and advance the causes the players care about without the disruption on the field. That's the business side. On the legal side, as I mentioned earlier, the NFL is a private institution. There is no First Amendment right, no freedom of speech while on the job. That doesn't mean the NFL has absolute legal discretion here. There are some limitations that might be causing the NFL to stay its hand in disciplining these players in some way. There are basically four areas of limitations. One is the civil rights laws that might apply. One is contract law. One is labor law, and one is local, municipal, and state law. So in terms of the civil rights laws, the players could argue that if the commissioner attempted to discipline their anthem protests, this is actually a form of discrimination based on race or some other special status, because what they're protesting is what they perceive as racist police brutality. That, I think, is the players' weakest argument, the civil rights laws, that they have some civil right to conduct these protests. A stronger argument, which is limited in its geography, is that there are a handful of states and cities where NFL teams play that have laws blocking employers from taking action over worker political views. There are laws in Seattle and California, so we're talking about a handful of teams where the NFL would not necessarily be able to penalize these players for their political views, if you can construe what's happening in that way. I also mentioned contract law and labor law, right? So it's very specific to the NFL. These players all play under a standard playing contract that is further subject to a collective bargaining agreement, another form of contract. Those contracts define the rights of the players. And both sides have argued as to the limits of what the commissioner can do under those contracts. The commissioner would argue that because the contracts prohibit players from engaging in conduct detrimental to the league, the commissioner could discipline them for kneeling during the anthem, that this is arguably creating some sort of reputational injury to the league, And so under the contracts, the standard playing contract and the collective bargaining agreement, the league could impose discipline. Why hasn't it done so far? Probably for the business reasons we discussed. They would rather work proactively and collaboratively with the players to accomplish something here, rather than insist on their rights under those contracts. There's one last area of law which might be relevant to the decision-making process of the league right now, and that is labor law protects workers in their right to engage in advocacy on workplace-related issues. So, for example, you asked for an incident where NFL players have previously used the game day platform to protest. You might remember the McCollum case. It's about 30 years old now, where Sam McCollum of the Seattle Seahawks raised his fist during the coin toss to protest the way that the league was treating the players in collective bargaining negotiations. He was disciplined for that, and he won his case in court because labor law protects workers' right to engage in advocacy on workplace issues. The question is kneeling during the anthem a workplace issue? It's kind of a stretch to say that what the players are doing here is some form of workplace-related protest.
That's fascinating, those different areas. Well, I guess the argument there would be the minute they step on the field, that's when their job starts. So the minute they get on there, that would be there. I want to talk about that damage that you mentioned, the reputational or economic damage. Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't this having an effect on ticket sales? Couldn't the argument be that maybe the reason the NFL is waiting to take action is, A, that hopefully it'll resolve itself, but wouldn't they have a stronger argument to let this go for a few months and say, look at all the damage this has caused? Our ticket sales went from here to here in a matter of 6 months, 7 months. To build that case up, wouldn't that be a stronger argument than to just take immediate action because they are building up their damage? Am I correct?
Well, there are a couple of things going on here in terms of the NFL's revenue streams, right? So the main revenue streams are TV. Those revenues are pretty much set in place for the next 4 or 5 years. They're not going to change. But the fact that ratings might be affected by these protests will impact the next round of television rights negotiations. Ticket sales. Most ticket sales are front-loaded in the NFL. So you may have a few stadia which are seeing a decline in ticket sales, but there is the issue of cause and effect, right? So what is causing community, national decline in interest in the NFL? If that decline is actually happening and is measurable, you can argue that it's a whole host of other reasons that have nothing to do with these protests. And I imagine that's what the players' arguments would be. I'm not sure the players are going to be that convinced about the impact of their protests on the game when you have all sorts of other factors that are contributing to whatever decline there might be in NFL viewership and fan following, such as other forms of entertainment, other ways technologically to get your NFL fix, fantasy games that lead people to want to stay at home and watch the games on TV to see multiple games so that they can participate more actively in their fantasy leagues. So the players would have a pretty good argument that it's unclear you can draw the causal connection between their protests and whatever decline there might be in fan interest. On the other hand, I think it's pretty clear it's not helping. And there is certainly a segment of the community, a vocal segment of the NFL fan community, who is disappointed in the league and the players, the way they're handling it, and are protesting in their own way by not participating in NFL season fanship.
Sure, you have to respect both sides. You understand both arguments, and that's what makes this such an interesting issue. I do want to talk about the idea of that you can measure damage, though, from sponsors. What about sponsors dropping their participation in these programs because they don't like what they're seeing? And I'm sure at your time at the NFL, you've dealt with a lot of these sponsorship contracts, these deals. Can you speak a little bit more about that aspect of it?
Well, as I said, the NFL's television rights revenues are in place right now for at least the next 4 or 5 years. The deals that they have are ongoing. But this will certainly affect the next round of negotiation. Any drop in ad revenue by the TV rights holders or subscription revenue by the TV rights holders is going to come back to haunt the NFL the next time they have to negotiate these contracts, whatever the reason. So it's in the NFL's interest, and frankly, the players' interest as well, to fix this problem, to right this ship, to make friends with those they've alienated. Because, face it, the players get 51% of those. At the moment, it's around 50% of those TV rights revenues. Under the collective bargaining salary cap and revenue sharing agreement, about 50% of that money goes into the players' pockets. So this is one of the reasons I think that the Players Association was very much welcomed the commissioner's outreach to meet in the last couple of weeks to try to address these issues in a way that resumes football as usual.
I like that. But let me ask you a question. We talk about a solution. What would be a good, if you're in this aspect there, it came to you and said, Professor, what do you think we should do here? Is the idea maybe before the anthem is played, I've heard this said before, have some sort of disclaimer saying we're stand up for the national anthem and its values, and not because the real deal is people are not standing up for political reasons, namely their disagreement with the current administration. If you had something along the lines of please stand up for the American flag, the national anthem, and what it represents as a country, because the main argument here for people who don't understand the kneeling is you are protesting the very thing that allows you to protest. So if you change a little disclaimer before the national anthem, please stand up for America and all of its values. I believe someone else had come up with this idea. Isn't that an avenue, the least restrictive means, a way to create a solution where it doesn't get on one bad side of one person or another? What do you think about that?
Well, I think that the real cause here has been lost in all the statements. I think that yet another statement about what we value as a country is has only so much value in terms of addressing the issues that motivated the players to protest in the first place, right? So I think what's getting lost in all this is that the players have an interest in addressing race-based policing in a way that ameliorates the community issues, the brutality issues, and they chose kneeling during the anthem as a way to bring attention to the issue, but that issue has now been forgotten. With all the controversy over the kneeling, nobody's talking about the underlying issues. And I think what, for instance, the Florida schools might do in addressing their issues, and the league and its Players Association might do on their front, is to return the conversation to the underlying issues. It's not about the anthem. It's about rebuilding trust between communities and police.
I agree with you. Again, that is what Colin Kaepernick, he originally knelt for. He was kneeling down because at that time there was so many cases of unarmed African-American individuals who were being shot by the police. So you have to understand that that's what the initial conversation was, and it became something else. I see, young kids kneeling down, and I wonder how many of them are kneeling down for a purpose or kneeling down because it's the cool thing to do right now. And again, it's a great thing to have a conversation, but I guess the bigger, broader issue is, what does this mean for our patriotism and tradition in our country? Because there is an importance to saying the national anthem and Pledge of Allegiance and standing, but at the same time, everyone has a right to protest and do this. So in a long term, you said, you spoke before that this has been happening for years where people protest. But there is a conversation that we're having now that's a little bit different, and it might be because of social media where messages get out to numerous amounts of people in a way that's never been able to do before. Do you see this affecting tradition and patriotism in America in a way that is very different from before?
Well, America does have some pretty unique patriotic traditions. If you've gone to sporting events in other countries, and I'm not talking about the Olympics, but you go to the English Premier League, they don't play God Save the Queen or the King at the outset of every match. The playing of the anthem in sporting events is a somewhat uniquely American tradition, and it happens to be a wonderful one that I think is useful in any community setting, whether it's a sports event or any other setting where people get together to experience a shared event or shared values, the message being confused by its use to protest unrelated or partially related community issues is it's going to be a difficult one to solve. And I don't know that disclaimers or codes of conduct are going to solve it. I think what needs to be done is refocus on the underlying issues. The schools in Florida have a wonderful opportunity here to hold conversations with their student bodies, with their communities, if those policing issues are relevant and happening in their communities. Have their students engage in public service events, have their students interact with communities that they don't necessarily encounter. Do something that actually promotes progress in the areas that the students claim to be protesting.
I like that. That's very well spoken about that, because again, a lot of the situation is you see people kneeling and you forget what the underlying reason is. And I think you made a great point that there are important issues here, and to create that conversation again, to drive it, to show why are people protesting and what can you do about it. That's the answer there. I'm curious, what is your biggest concern with this issue? Would the worst thing be if the NFL decides to take some remedial action against the players, it turns into a big fight, that maybe a class action lawsuit is filed on behalf of the players against the league? What's the worst case scenario that we could see if this issue, like you said, doesn't get resolved in such an articulate way as you explained, but it just gets to the worst level? What could even happen? What could be the next step in towards a negative aspect here?
Well, I think the worst case scenario would involve the players stepping up their political messaging in some way, right? So the law about not respecting the anthem or the flag is muddy enough that the NFL is unlikely to punish a player for kneeling or refusing to salute. But if the players stepped it up so that game day on-field messaging became even more politicized with T-shirts or signs or slogans, I think that's the point at which the commissioner would have to step in and impose discipline. And that, to me, would be a worst-case scenario for the players. I also think that, and for the league as a whole, I also think that the players understand that regardless of their skill, ability, their talent, there's a lot of discretion in coaching. Right. Coaches play who they think will contribute to team unity and success on the field. And the Colin Kaepernick problem is not, he's not alone in facing that issue. And I'm talking about the fact that he was never re-signed despite his quite well-established abilities. No team has signed him to play. There's a so-called disruption factor that teams are concerned about. I think that's happening on the ground right now amongst other NFL teams. Coaches are making decisions about playing players based on what they contribute to team unity. And if a player is disruptive for whatever reason, whether it's because they don't stand for the anthem or for some other reason, they're going to get less playing time. I think that's eventually going to bring the players around to understanding that we need another solution here.
I hope so, Professor. I agree with you. I hope that is the answer. And you were great today. Thank you so much for your analysis here. It really was very important, and I think it helped enlighten this conversation in the larger aspect. So again, Associate Professor of Brooklyn Law School, Jodi Balsam, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll make sure to have you on for this discussion or another entertainment topic coming up along the way. Thank you again for joining us here on Law News.
Thank you.